October 26, 1881, Tombstone, Arizona Territory, a mining boomtown brimming with wealth, lawlessness, and ambition. In a vacant lot behind a livery stable, two factions collide. On one side stand Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, lawmen sworn to uphold order, joined by the gambler and gunslinger Doc Holliday. On the other side, Ike and Billy Clanton with their allies, the McClory brothers, ranchers branded as outlaws, and part of the loose confederation known simply as the Cowboys. In less than half a minute, nearly 30 gunshots will shatter the dusty silence. When the smoke clears, 3 men lie dead, others wounded, and Tombstone is forever changed. History remembers this as the gunfight at the OK Corral. But that famous showdown was only the beginning. What followed was a bitter feud of revenge, ambushes, and assassinations that turned the Arizona frontier into a battlefield. This is not just the tale of a single gunfight. It is the story of a war between law and outlaw, between order and anarchy, between myth and reality. In the weeks after the OK Corral, Virgil Earp would be left crippled by an assassin's shotgun blast. Morgan Earp would be murdered in cold blood while playing billiards. Wyatt, seeking justice, would abandon the courtroom and take to the saddle, leading a hand-picked posse on what became known as the Vendetta Ride. The Earps' pursuit of vengeance would leave more men dead, more families torn apart, and Wyatt himself transformed from a lawman into a figure straddling the line between justice and outlawry. Yet what truly happened in Tombstone is more complex than legend. Court records, newspaper accounts, and eyewitness testimony reveal contradictions and doubts. Was Wyatt Earp a heroic defender of the law, or a ruthless opportunist seeking power and profit? Were the Cowboys simple rustlers and stagecoach robbers, or victims of an ambitious lawman's rise? For more than a century, writers, filmmakers, and historians have returned to this bloody drama, shaping Wyatt Earp into both saint and sinner. But beneath the myth lies the real war, one fought in the dusty streets of Tombstone and across the Arizona frontier in the winter of 1881 and 1882. This is the story of Wyatt Earp and the Cowboy War. Act 1. Trouble in Tombstone. By the dawn of the 1880s, Tombstone was no longer a lonely mining camp scratched out of the desert. What began in 1877 with Ed Schieffelin's first silver strike had erupted into one of the richest boomtowns in the Arizona Territory. In just a few short years, tents gave way to wooden storefronts, rough tracks became crowded streets, and more than 20,000 people called Tombstone home. The lure was silver, tons of it, dug from the hills that shimmered white in the sunlight. Fortune seekers poured in from every corner of the country. Miners, merchants, gamblers, and adventurers all scrambled for a piece of the wealth. In their wake came the saloons, the theaters, the gambling dens, and the brothels that promised to separate men from their winnings as quickly as they made them. But prosperity had a price. A boomtown meant opportunity for honest work and for crime. Stagecoaches carrying bullion were tempting targets. Ranches on the open range were vulnerable to rustling. Disputes over claims or debts could be settled with fists, knives, or revolvers. Tombstone became a place where the promise of riches stood shoulder to shoulder with the threat of sudden violence. Law in the territory was fragile. Sheriffs and marshals were outnumbered by the men they tried to police, and their authority often extended no farther than the barrel of their own guns. Justice depended not on uniform codes or steady institutions, but on who could muster the most supporters when a quarrel erupted. It was here that the Earp brothers saw opportunity. Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan arrived with reputations forged in saloons and frontier towns across the West. Each had worked as peace officers, each had gambled, fought, and carried a gun for a living. In Tombstone, they hoped to combine law enforcement with profit, staking claims, running saloons, and building influence. Yet the Earps were not the only power in town. On the outskirts and in the ranches of Cochise County, another force gathered strength. Known collectively as the Cowboys, they were a loose confederation of ranchers, rustlers, and gunmen who thrived in the wide, unpoliced spaces of the borderlands. Tombstone was growing fast, but beneath its prosperity, two rival visions of the frontier were taking shape, and they were destined to collide. The Earps brought with them more than experience as lawmen. They carried ambition. Virgil, the eldest, quickly secured the position of city marshal, giving the family official authority in a town desperate for order. Wyatt, often remembered as the central figure, balanced his time between gambling tables and real estate, cultivating both profit and political influence. Morgan, the youngest, was loyal and eager, ready to back his brothers in whatever conflict arose. But no Earp carried as much notoriety into Tombstone as the man who rode with them, John Henry Doc Holliday. Once a practicing dentist in Georgia, Holliday's life had been upended by tuberculosis. Told he would not live long, he sought relief in the dry climate of the West. What he found instead was gambling, liquor, and violence. Gaunt, pale, and often racked with coughing fits, Holliday nonetheless earned a reputation as a deadly gunman with a hair-trigger temper. His loyalty to Wyatt Earp was unquestioned, and together the two men became inseparable figures in the frontier legend. The presence of the Earps and Holliday gave Tombstone something it had not had before, a determined block of lawmen willing to assert control. But it also ensured resistance from those who viewed law as an obstacle rather than protection. That resistance was embodied by the Cowboys. They were not a gang in the formal sense. There was no hierarchy, no written code, no leader who could be held accountable. Instead, they were bound by friendship, blood ties, and common cause. The Clanton family, patriarch Newman Haynes, Old Man Clanton and his sons, Ike and Billy, stood at the center. Alongside them rode the McClory brothers, Frank and Tom, and a host of other ranchers, rustlers, and drifters who made their living as much from theft and smuggling as from cattle. To townsfolk aligned with the Earps, the Cowboys were nothing more than organized bandits, stagecoach robbers, cattle thieves, and murderers in wide-brimmed hats. But to many in the ranching community, they were neighbors and protectors, men who resisted the growing dominance of business interests and federal law. Two visions of the West had taken root in Arizona. One looked to profit, expansion, and the rule of law. The other clung to the freedom of the open range, where the fastest gun could settle any dispute. In Tombstone, these two worlds would soon collide, and when they did, the streets would run red with blood. By the summer of 1881, the fragile peace in Tombstone was unraveling. The town's wealth had drawn in every kind of opportunist, but its sudden prosperity also magnified every rivalry. At the heart of the trouble were the Cowboys. Their raids across the Mexican border and their growing reputation for stagecoach robberies threatened to choke the lifeblood of commerce that kept Tombstone alive. Each robbery stirred outrage in the town, and each outrage brought pressure on lawmen to act. Virgil Earp, as city marshal, faced demands from merchants and investors to rein in the Cowboys and safeguard the wealth pouring out of the silver mines. But enforcing order in a town like Tombstone meant crossing powerful men, and Virgil's every action deepened the resentment of those already determined to resist him. For Wyatt, the feud became personal. His ambitions in politics and business put him in direct competition with Sheriff Johnny Bahan. The two men clashed repeatedly, not only over jurisdiction, but over reputation. Their rivalry turned bitter when Wyatt courted Josephine Marcus, a woman Bahan had once claimed as his lover. In the saloons of Tombstone, men whispered that the feud between sheriff and gambler was as much about a woman as it was about law. Doc Holliday, meanwhile, carried his own quarrels. His temper and quick draw made him a dangerous enemy, and his loyalty to Wyatt ensured that any insult against him became an insult against the Earps. For the Cowboys, Holliday's presence was a provocation in itself, a sickly gambler who carried a six-shooter with the recklessness of a man who knew he would not live long. The Cowboys answered with their own bluster. Ike Clanton in particular was known for his threats, often delivered after long hours of drinking. Again and again, he promised that he would kill the Earps, and though many dismissed his rants as the talk of a drunkard, the tension in Tombstone made every word feel like a spark near dry powder. By autumn, the town was split in two. In the saloons and gambling halls, men took sides, pro-Earp or pro-Cowboy. Each fresh insult, each hint of violence, brought Tombstone closer to a reckoning. And in October, that reckoning would arrive. October of 1881 began with the uneasy calm of a town waiting for trouble. The Earps continued their rounds as lawmen, while the Cowboys rode in and out of Tombstone, armed and defiant. Each encounter seemed smaller than the last. An argument in a saloon, a fine in court, a threat shouted across Fremont Street, but each one stacked atop the other, like logs piled high for a fire. On October 25th, Ike Clanton arrived in town. He spent the evening drinking heavily, boasting in saloons that the Earps would not live another day. Several witnesses later swore they heard him threaten murder outright. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Ike was still carrying his Winchester rifle and revolver, a direct violation of Tombstone's ordinance, requiring all firearms to be checked with the sheriff or at a saloon. Virgil Earp moved quickly. Ike was arrested, fined for carrying weapons in town, and released. But humiliation cut deep. When the younger Clantons, Billy, along with the McClory brothers, Frank and Tom, rode into Tombstone later that day, they found Ike simmering with rage. Together, they made their presence felt, parading through the streets armed and daring the Earps to face them. The tension was impossible to ignore. Crowds began to gather as word spread that a confrontation was inevitable. Some townspeople watched with curiosity, others with dread. For many, Tombstone's prosperity had always felt fragile. Now it seemed about to collapse in bloodshed. Sheriff Behan attempted to mediate, approaching the Cowboys to convince them to disarm. But Behan's loyalties were divided, and his authority carried little weight against the anger of the moment. The Cowboys lingered near the OK Corral, refusing to surrender their weapons, muttering threats that the Earps would not leave the day alive. For the Earp brothers, retreat was impossible. To back down meant the ordinance was meaningless, their authority a sham. To act meant violence was certain. At around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan, joined by Doc Holliday, began walking purposefully down Fremont Street. The crowd parted as they passed, the sound of boots striking dirt echoing in the silence. At the far end of the street, the Cowboys waited. The confrontation that had been building for months was about to explode. As the Earps and Doc Holliday advanced down Fremont Street, the weight of the moment pressed on every witness. The brothers walked in a tight line, Wyatt on one side, Virgil at the center, Morgan to the other, Holliday trailing with a shotgun hidden under his long coat. Their expressions were grim, their steps steady. To bystanders, it looked less like a patrol than a march into history. Ahead, near the rear entrance of the OK Corral, the Cowboys gathered, Ike and Billy Clanton, Frank and Tom McClory, and Billy Claiborne. Some stood beside their saddled horses, others lingered with revolvers still strapped to their sides. To the townsfolk, the sight was unmistakable. These men were not preparing to surrender. The crowd pressed closer, filling doorways and leaning from windows, anxious to see who would break first. In Tombstone, everyone had taken sides. To some, the Earps were the law, walking into danger to defend the town's ordinance. To others, they were aggressors, ready to spill blood for pride and profit. Sheriff Behan intercepted the Earps as they closed the distance. He insisted the Cowboys had already been disarmed, but the revolvers at their hips told another story. Behan's attempt at diplomacy had failed, and the lawman brushed past him. Now the distance shrank with every step. The lawmen advanced steadily, their boots crunching against the dirt. The Cowboys shifted uneasily, hands hovering near their weapons. The noise of the crowd faded to silence. Tombstone had become a powder keg, and in the next moment the spark would be struck. Act 2. The Gunfight. The lot was no wider than a stable yard, boxed in by fences and outbuildings, barely 30 feet across. On one side stood the Cowboys, Billy and Ike Clanton, Frank and Tom McClory, and Billy Claiborne. On the other, Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan Earp, with Doc Holliday at their flank. The two groups faced each other at less than 10 feet. The silence was unbearable. Townsfolk watching from Fremont Street remembered the moment as one of suspended breath when the only sound was the restless stamping of the Cowboys' horses. The lawmen advanced a single step closer, the dust crunching under their boots. Virgil Earp raised his hand. Some witnesses swore he shouted, "Throw up your hands! I want your guns!" Others claimed the words were never spoken. The testimony would never agree, because in the next instant the stillness shattered. A gun roared, then another, and in the space of a heartbeat, the lot became a storm of smoke and fire. At such close range, there was no room for caution. Tom McClory stumbled back as Holliday's shotgun thundered. Frank McClory fired wildly, taking bullets from Morgan and Virgil before steadying himself long enough to return fire. Billy Clanton, barely 19, stood his ground, emptying his revolver shot after shot, even as blood poured from his side. Wyatt, in his later accounts, insisted that he fired calmly, deliberately, and that he missed no shot. Witnesses remembered him standing almost motionless, the picture of cold precision amid the chaos. The gunfire was deafening. Each blast kicked up dust and smoke until the air turned thick and choking. Horses screamed, men shouted curses, and the crack of revolvers came so fast it was impossible to tell one from the next. Ike Clanton, who had promised loudly that he would kill the Earps, never fired a round. He fled the lot unscathed, disappearing into the crowd as the gunfight raged behind him. When the shooting stopped, less than 30 seconds had passed. 3 Cowboys lay dead or dying. 3 of the lawmen were wounded. Only Wyatt Earp stood untouched. The most infamous 30 seconds in frontier history were over. But for Tombstone, the bloodshed had only just begun. When the smoke cleared, silence returned as suddenly as the violence had begun. Bodies lay sprawled in the dust. Tom McClory was dead where he had fallen, torn apart by Holliday's shotgun blast. Frank McClory staggered a few paces before collapsing, a revolver still clutched in his hand. Billy Clanton, barely 19 years old, lay groaning on the ground, mortally wounded but defiant to the end. Witnesses swore that even as he bled out, he begged for more cartridges so he could keep fighting. Among the lawmen, only Wyatt Earp was untouched. Virgil and Morgan both carried wounds, blood seeping through their clothes. Doc Holliday's coat was torn by a grazing shot, though he survived unscathed. To the crowd that rushed in from Fremont Street, it looked like the Earps had won a clear victory. 3 Cowboys dead, the rest scattered. But in Tombstone, nothing was simple. Within minutes, shouts of murder echoed through the streets. Supporters of the Cowboys claimed the Earps had executed men in cold blood, gunning them down even after they tried to surrender. Friends of the Earps insisted the lawmen had been ambushed, firing only in self-defense. Sheriff Behan, his own loyalty suspect, fanned the controversy by declaring that the Earps had acted illegally. He swore under oath that the Cowboys had been trying to give up their weapons when the shooting began. Others contradicted him, testifying that the Clantons and McClorys had drawn first. The coroner's inquest lasted 3 weeks. Witness after witness filled the courtroom, each account conflicting with the last. Some insisted Holliday had fired the first shot. Others claimed it was Frank McClory. Still others placed the blame squarely on Wyatt. The only certainty was that 3 men were dead, and the feud that had divided Tombstone was far from finished. The verdict cleared the Earps and Holliday of murder. The coroner ruled that the killings were justified under the law. But for the Cowboys and for many of Tombstone's citizens, the fight was not over. To them, the OK Corral was not the end of the war. It was only the beginning. For supporters of the Cowboys, the dead became martyrs. Friends and family of the Clantons and McClorys mourned them as victims of cold-blooded murder. Their funerals drew crowds of sympathizers, men and women who whispered that the Earps had crossed a line from lawmen into killers. Newspaper editorials split sharply along partisan lines. Some praised the Earps for enforcing the ordinance and defending order. Others condemned them as assassins who had shot down ranchers in broad daylight. Sheriff Johnny Behan added fuel to the fire. Though he had failed to disarm the Cowboys before the shooting, he now positioned himself as their defender. His testimony at the inquest painted the Earps as aggressors, and his influence over county politics ensured that the anti-Earp faction had an official voice. The Earps, meanwhile, carried themselves with a mix of pride and unease. Wyatt claimed he had acted without hesitation, calm under fire, and never once missed his mark. His words added to his legend, but they also hardened the bitterness of those who had lost kin at the OK Corral. Virgil, as town marshal, knew the danger was far from over. He walked the streets with his arm still bandaged from his wounds, determined to show that law remained intact. But the Cowboys were not finished. Ike Clanton, humiliated for fleeing the fight without firing a shot, spoke openly of revenge. Other members of the faction muttered threats in saloons, promising that the Earps would not live long enough to enjoy their victory. In Tombstone, daily life resumed. Silver still flowed from the mines, saloons still echoed with laughter and gunfire. But beneath the bustle, the atmosphere was poisonous. Everyone knew the feud had only paused, not ended. The blood spilled in the lot beside Fly's photography studio had not closed the conflict. It had merely drawn the first battle lines of what locals were already calling the Cowboy War. The Cowboys did not wait long to strike back. On the night of December 28, 1881, barely 2 months after the OK Corral, Virgil Earp left the Oriental Saloon and started across 5th Street. The town marshal walked with the calm stride of a man still carrying authority, though his left arm remained stiff from the wound he had taken in the gunfight. In the darkness, hidden figures watched him pass. Suddenly, the silence shattered. A shotgun roared, followed by the crack of pistols. Buckshot tore through Virgil's shoulder and arm, shattering bone. He collapsed in the street as the attackers melted back into the night. Miraculously, he survived, though his left arm was permanently crippled. For the Earps, the message was unmistakable. The Cowboys had declared open war. Tombstone citizens woke to find their town gripped by fear. If the marshal himself could be ambushed in the heart of town, no one was safe. Some whispered that the rule of law was collapsing, that the Cowboys would soon control the streets. Wyatt, however, was unmoved by fear. With Virgil bedridden and stripped of his duties, Wyatt was deputized as acting marshal. He swore to keep order, but in his private words to friends, he promised revenge. The Cowboys, emboldened, grew louder in their threats. Ike Clanton boasted that Virgil's shooting was only the beginning. Others hinted that Morgan Earp would be the next target. Tension in Tombstone turned poisonous. Families locked their doors at night, while saloon owners kept pistols under the bar. Sheriff Behan offered little comfort. Though sworn to uphold the law, his sympathies remained with the Cowboys, and he made no real effort to bring the shooters to justice. To the Earps, His inaction was proof that the county's top lawman had chosen his side. Virgil's ambush changed everything. The feud was no longer confined to insults, fines, or courtroom battles. The Cowboys had shown they would strike in the dark, and the Earps knew they would have to answer in kind. March 18, 1882. The streets of Tombstone were quieter than usual, but the tension had only grown heavier. Just before midnight, Morgan Earp stepped into Hatch's billiard parlor on Allen Street. He had spent the evening with friends, playing cards and shooting pool, trying to push aside the constant threats that shadowed his family. Wyatt and Doc Holliday lingered nearby, sharing drinks and keeping a watchful eye. Morgan leaned over the billiard table, lining up his next shot. At that instant, a shotgun blast tore through the rear door of the saloon. The lead charge slammed into his back, shattering his spine. The room erupted in chaos. Patrons dove for cover as a second shot rang out, narrowly missing Wyatt. By the time the smoke cleared, the gunman had fled into the night, leaving Morgan crumpled on the floor. He was carried to a nearby house where doctors could do nothing. Within an hour, he was dead. Wyatt later recalled sitting at his brother's side as the life drained from him. For all his reputation as a cold, calculating man, the moment seared into him with fury and grief. Morgan had been only 30 years old. The murder shocked Tombstone. To the Earps' supporters, it was proof that the Cowboys would stop at nothing. To the Cowboys' allies, it was simply one more turn in a violent feud. But to Wyatt Earp, Morgan's death was personal. The feud had claimed his brother's life, and he would not wait for courts or sheriffs to deliver justice. The next morning, the Earps gathered. Virgil, still crippled from his own ambush, prepared to leave Tombstone with his family for safety. Wyatt, however, made a different choice. Sworn in as a U.S. Deputy Marshal, he declared he would finish the fight. Doc Holliday, still coughing blood into his handkerchief, pledged to ride with him. Morgan's body was placed in a coffin and carried out of town, bound for California. As the funeral procession departed, Wyatt watched silently. The vendetta that would define his legend was about to begin. Act 3. The Vendetta Ride. The morning after Morgan's murder, Tombstone was a town divided by fear. Some believed the Earps would leave broken and beaten. Others expected them to lash out with the full force of their anger. Wyatt made the choice quickly. He would not retreat. He would hunt down the men he held responsible, and he would not wait for warrants or courtrooms. Sworn in as a deputy U.S. Marshal, Wyatt gathered a small posse. At his side rode Doc Holliday, loyal despite his failing health. Warren Earp, the youngest brother, joined them, determined to avenge Morgan. Along with trusted allies like Sherman McMaster, Turkey Creek, Jack Johnson, and Texas Jack Vermillion, the group became known as the Earp Vendetta Posse. Their mission was clear: track the Cowboys, kill those who had taken part in the ambushes, and send a message that the feud would end only one way. For Wyatt, the line between law and vengeance disappeared. He carried his badge, but his true authority came from grief and rage. The first target was Frank Stillwell, a cowboy with a long record of threats and suspected crimes. On March 20th, as Virgil prepared to leave Arizona by train for California, Stillwell was spotted lurking near the station in Tucson. Wyatt and his men confronted him in the rail yard. Gunfire erupted in the dark, and by the time it ended, Stillwell's body was riddled with bullets. Some claimed Wyatt himself fired both barrels of a shotgun into him at close range. The killing electrified Arizona. To the Cowboys and their sympathizers, it was cold-blooded murder. To the Earps' supporters, it was frontier justice delivered without hesitation. Wyatt made no apologies. He declared openly that the vendetta had begun and that none of the Cowboys who had attacked his family would escape. Newspapers carried the story across the country. Some painted Wyatt as a lawman pushed too far, striking back against a criminal gang. Others described him as an outlaw with a badge, leading a band of killers on a personal crusade. In Tombstone, one thing was certain: the vendetta had started, and the desert would soon run red with more blood. The body of Frank Stillwell was scarcely buried before Wyatt and his men struck again. 2 days later, they cornered Florentino Indian Charlie Cruz, a man suspected of aiding in Morgan's assassination. Cruz was found hiding near a woodpile outside Tombstone. The posse surrounded him, demanding answers. When his story faltered, Wyatt ordered him executed. The message was unmistakable. The vendetta would show no mercy. By now, the cowboys were on edge. Rumors swirled through the saloons and ranches of Cochise County. Wyatt Earp was no longer enforcing law. He was hunting men. Supporters whispered his name with awe. Enemies spat it with hatred. But all agreed he would not stop until blood had been answered with blood. The showdown everyone anticipated came on March 24, 1882, at Iron Springs, a lonely watering hole in the desert. Wyatt's posse had been tracking a group of cowboys when they suddenly stumbled upon Curly Bill Brocious himself, the outlaw many believed had masterminded the ambushes against the Earps. The encounter was chaotic and violent. Curly Bill opened fire with a shotgun, the blast nearly striking Wyatt at point-blank range. Dust and smoke filled the air as bullets whined across the desert scrub. Wyatt, steady as ever, drew his revolver and fired again and again. When the smoke cleared, Curly Bill lay dead in the sand, his body riddled with bullets. The killing of Curly Bill sent shockwaves across the territory. For years, he had been a symbol of cowboy power, feared even by his own allies. His death at the hands of Wyatt Earp was both a triumph and a provocation. The cowboys were leaderless but not defeated, and their thirst for vengeance burned even hotter. Newspapers across the country seized on the story. Some hailed Wyatt as a fearless avenger who had cleansed the frontier of a notorious outlaw. Others condemned him as a vigilante who had abandoned the rule of law. Whatever the truth, Wyatt Earp's name was now etched indelibly into the legend of the West. The vendetta was not finished. Wyatt's posse remained in the field, hunted as much as hunters. The desert was wide, and the feud was not yet at its bloody end. The killing of Curly Bill Brocious marked the high point of Wyatt Earp's vendetta, but it also marked the beginning of the end. The posse had struck hard, cutting down 3 men in less than a week, and now the territory's law turned against them. Warrants were issued for Wyatt and his riders on charges of murder. In the eyes of Cochise County's authorities, the Avengers had become outlaws. Still, Wyatt pressed on. His posse scoured the backcountry, searching for known cowboys and their allies. Skirmishes flared in canyons and arroyos, brief bursts of gunfire that left more men dead. Each fight widened the rift between the Earps and their enemies. What had begun as a feud in Tombstone had transformed into a roaming war across the Arizona desert. But the costs were mounting, supplies ran low, and safe havens grew scarce. The vendetta posse found themselves pursued as much as pursuers, hunted by sheriffs and deputies loyal to the cowboys. The desert, once their ally, became a trap of heat, hunger, and isolation. By late April, the momentum had shifted. Wyatt realized that the vendetta could not last forever. He had avenged Morgan, struck down Curly Bill, and shattered the cowboy leadership, but he could not fight the entire county and the law indefinitely. One by one, members of the posse drifted away. Some returned to their homes, others vanished into the frontier. Doc Holliday, coughing harder each day, followed Wyatt but knew his strength was failing. The ride that had begun in fury was running out of men and out of time. In the spring of 1882, Wyatt Earp left Arizona Territory. He carried no regrets for the men he had killed. To him, the vendetta was justice, pure and unflinching. To others, he departed as a fugitive, a lawman who had crossed the line into outlawry. Tombstone remained behind, scarred and divided. The mines still produced silver, the saloons still filled with gamblers and drinkers, but the shadow of the feud lingered. The Cowboy War had ended, not with a treaty or a trial, but with blood spilled in the desert and the Earps gone from the town they had once sought to control. The man behind the legend. When Wyatt Earp rode out of Arizona in the spring of 1882, he left behind more than a town. He left behind a feud that had consumed his family, a reputation stained by blood, and the place where myth and reality had become impossible to separate. But his story did not end in Tombstone. In many ways, it had only begun. In the months that followed, Wyatt drifted westward, moving through Colorado, New Mexico, and eventually California. He carried with him Doc Holliday, though their partnership grew strained. The tuberculosis that plagued Holliday worsened with every passing year, and his notorious temper made him a difficult companion. By 1887, Doc was dead in a Colorado sanitarium, far from the desert gunfights that had defined his legend. Wyatt, meanwhile, turned again to gambling, prize fighting, and speculation. He wore a badge at times, serving briefly as a lawman in Colorado and Idaho, but his days of gunfights and vendettas were largely behind him. Instead, he sought opportunity in the shifting frontiers of the American West, not only on the range, but in the cities rising with the new century. He lived in San Diego during its boom years, profiting from saloons and gambling halls. Later, he moved to Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush, chasing fortune in the frozen North. With his common-law wife, Josephine Marcus, he eventually settled in California, living a quieter life in Los Angeles as the West around him transformed into a modern world. Yet even in old age, Wyatt could not escape the shadow of Tombstone. Reporters sought him out, eager for stories of the OK Corral. Writers and filmmakers painted him alternately as a fearless lawman or a ruthless killer. Each retelling blurred fact with fiction until the man himself became inseparable from the legend. By the time Wyatt died in 1929 at the age of 80, Hollywood had already begun to remake the West in its own image. Directors and actors visited his modest home in Los Angeles, eager to shake hands with the last surviving gunfighter of Tombstone. To them, Wyatt Earp was not just a man, he was the embodiment of the Wild West itself. When Wyatt Earp died in Los Angeles in January 1929, few could have predicted how large his name would loom in the decades to follow. At the time, obituaries were mixed. Some hailed him as a fearless frontier marshal, others remembered him as a gambler and gunman who had lived on the edge of the law. But in the years that followed, a transformation occurred. The man became a legend. One of the first to shape that legend was Stuart Lake, a writer who interviewed Wyatt in his final years. In 1931, Lake published Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. The book was less biography than hagiography. Lake polished Wyatt's rough edges, downplayed his gambling and vigilantism, and elevated him as the very model of frontier justice. Though historians later challenged its accuracy, the book was a sensation. Hollywood soon followed. Beginning in the 1930s and continuing for decades, films portrayed Wyatt as the quintessential lawman of the Old West. Henry Fonda, Burt Lancaster, and Kurt Russell would all wear the star and walk down Fremont Street on the silver screen. Each performance added new layers to the myth, recasting Wyatt not as a complicated man, but as a symbol of order triumphing over chaos. The OK Corral itself became legend. Tourists flocked to Tombstone, eager to stand where the gunfight had taken place. Souvenir shops, reenactments, and museums turned a 30-second exchange of gunfire into a cornerstone of American folklore. The feud that had once divided a mining town now united generations in fascination. Yet the truth remained more complex. Historians pointed out inconsistencies, contradictions, and outright fabrications in the stories told about Wyatt. Was he a hero who defended the law against ruthless outlaws? Or was he a gambler who used a badge to settle personal grudges? The answer, as always, lay somewhere in between. What was undeniable was Wyatt Earp's place in the American imagination. More than any other figure, he came to represent the transition from the lawless frontier to the rule of order. He was both man and myth, his story reshaped to fit the needs of every generation that retold it. And through that myth, Wyatt Earp became immortal. Act 5. Fact and Fiction. The legend of Wyatt Earp has endured for nearly a century, but separating fact from fiction is no easy task. The stories that shaped him were told by allies, enemies, journalists, and filmmakers, each with their own agenda. What remains is a puzzle, fragments of truth scattered among exaggerations and outright inventions. Take the gunfight itself. Popular memory calls it the gunfight at the OK Corral. In reality, the fight did not take place in the corral at all, but in a narrow lot beside Fly's photography studio. The name came later, a catchy phrase that lent itself to headlines and movie posters. Even the duration of the fight is often misunderstood. On screen, it is stretched into a drawn-out battle of wills. In truth, it lasted less than 30 seconds. Nearly 30 shots were fired in that half-minute, a blur of smoke and chaos that no witness could describe with perfect clarity. Then there is the question of character. Wyatt Earp is remembered as the epitome of frontier justice, a man who stood tall against lawlessness. But contemporary records show a more complicated figure. He gambled frequently, bent the rules when it suited him, and was not above using his badge for personal gain. His alliance with Doc Holliday, a volatile gambler with a reputation for violence, only deepened suspicions that the Earps were as much a faction as the cowboys they opposed. On the other hand, the cowboys themselves were not the simple ranchers of some sympathetic accounts. Many were implicated in stagecoach robberies, cattle theft, and cross-border smuggling. Their loyalties were rooted less in principle than in survival and profit. To their neighbors, they could be generous and protective. To their enemies, they were ruthless outlaws. The truth of Tombstone lies in the gray space between hero and villain. The Earps and the Cowboys both embodied the contradictions of the frontier, where law was fragile, loyalties ran deep, and violence was always near at hand. As historians probed the story of Tombstone, they found that memory was as contested as the gunfight itself. Every witness left a different version. Some insisted the cowboys had tried to surrender. Others swore they drew first. Court records captured sworn testimony, but the contradictions were so sharp that no definitive truth could ever be fixed. This uncertainty gave later generations room to shape the story as they wished. In the early 20th century, writers like Stuart Lake cast Wyatt as the archetypal lawman, honorable, steady, and incorruptible. His portrayal became the blueprint for countless novels, radio dramas, and Western films. But in the second half of the century, revisionist historians began to dig deeper. They highlighted Wyatt's gambling, his questionable business dealings, and the possibility that his vendetta ride blurred the line between lawman and outlaw. Some painted him as a man driven more by profit and personal pride than by principle. Others suggested that his true talent lay not in gunfighting, but in surviving. He outlived nearly all of his contemporaries, giving him the final word on his own story. What emerged was less a tale of good versus evil than a portrait of a violent frontier town where law and order were fragile and where every man carried his own code of justice. The OK Corral became a mirror, reflecting the values of whoever told the story. For Americans in the 1930s, it was a story of courage and law, triumphing over chaos. For filmmakers of the 1950s, it was a stage for noble sacrifice. For historians of the 1970s and beyond, it became a case study in myth-making, where the truth was less important than the legend it produced. Yet through all the revisions, Wyatt Earp endures. His name remains synonymous with the Old West, a symbol recognized across the world. To some, he is the ultimate frontier marshal. To others, he is proof that history is never simple, that heroes and villains often share the same traits. In the end, the real Wyatt Earp was both more and less than the legend. He was a gambler, a lawman, a killer, and a survivor. And it is that complexity, more than any single version, that has kept his story alive for over a century. The fascination with Wyatt Earp tells us as much about America as it does about the man himself. The West was never just a place, it was an idea, a stage where the nation imagined its own identity. And in that drama, Wyatt became a central character. His story reflects the tension at the heart of the frontier. Americans wanted to believe in law and progress in towns that could grow from mining camps into thriving communities. Yet they were equally drawn to the image of the lone gunman, the man who stood outside the law and imposed his own justice with a revolver. Wyatt embodied both. He wore a badge, but he also gambled, fought, and avenged his family without waiting for a court's verdict. The OK Corral became a symbol not because it resolved the conflict of Tombstone, but because it captured that contradiction in a single burst of violence. A lawman and a gambler, outlaws who were also neighbors and ranchers. A gunfight that lasted less than half a minute, yet echoed for more than a century. Other figures of the Old West, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Wild Bill Hickok, were remembered for their flair, their recklessness, or their tragic deaths. Wyatt was remembered because he survived. He lived long enough to see his story retold, to shake hands with Hollywood directors, to leave behind not only memories, but living testimony. In a land where myth and memory blend, survival is its own kind of power. Today, scholars continue to sift through the evidence, debating every bullet, every testimony, every decision. But perhaps the reason Wyatt's name endures is that his story cannot be pinned down. He is at once hero and anti-hero, lawman and outlaw, a man whose life forces us to accept that history is rarely simple. The story of Wyatt Earp, then, is not just the story of a single man or a single town. It is the story of how America remembers itself, how it turns messy, violent, human lives into legends that speak to larger truths. And in that legend, Wyatt Earp still walks down Fremont Street, steady, unflinching, caught forever in the moment before the guns erupt. The epilogue, the lasting echo. Today, Tombstone still stands. Its dusty streets, once alive with miners and saloon girls, gamblers and gunmen, are lined with reenactments, museums, and gift shops. Tourists gather daily to watch the gunfight, performed on the very ground where it happened, though the stage is as much theater as history. The OK Corral has become less a place than an idea, a symbol of the Wild West distilled into 30 seconds of smoke and gunfire. Yet behind the myth, the human cost lingers. Tom and Frank McClory, Billy Clanton, Virgil and Morgan Earp, and countless others were not legends, but men. They laughed, drank, gambled, and dreamed, only to be swept into a feud that defined their lives and deaths. For all the silver that poured from Tombstone's mines, it was blood that gave the town its place in history. Wyatt Earp's name became immortal, but the town itself faded. By the end of the 19th century, the silver boom had collapsed, and Tombstone shrank into obscurity. Only the legend remained, retold in dime novels and Hollywood films until the reality of the place was almost forgotten. And yet, perhaps that is why the story endures. The gunfight at the OK Corral was not a battle of heroes and villains. It was a glimpse into the uncertainty of the frontier, where law and outlaw often looked alike, and where survival demanded choices that could never be clean. Standing in Tombstone today, it is easy to imagine the silence before the shots, the dust in the air, the quick pull of a trigger. It is easy to believe that history still echoes there. trapped in the space between memory and myth. The legend of Wyatt Earp remains not because it was simple, but because it was complicated. It reminds us that the West was not carved by heroes alone, but by flawed men caught in extraordinary circumstances. And perhaps that is the truest story of all. In the end, Wyatt Earp's story is less about a single gunfight than about the way history is remembered. The OK Corral was 30 seconds of violence in a town that rose and fell with the silver trade, yet it has come to stand for the entire frontier experience. It is a reminder that the Wild West was not defined by landscapes or timelines, but by the stories people chose to tell. For some, Wyatt is the ideal lawman, steady under fire, unbending in the face of lawlessness. For others, he is a vigilante cloaked in a badge, a man who used the cover of authority to wage personal war. Both images are true, and neither is complete. The real man lived somewhere in between, like Tombstone itself, balanced between order and chaos, prosperity and ruin. His enemies, too, deserve their place in memory. The Cowboys were not faceless villains, but neighbors, ranchers, and sons whose lives were cut short in a feud that spun beyond anyone's control. Their story is a reminder that the frontier was not just a canvas for heroes, but a place where ordinary people were caught in the whirlwind of history. That is why the legend endures. The gunfight has been retold in countless ways, on paper, on film, on the stage, and each version reveals as much about the teller as about the tale. The West becomes what each generation needs it to be, a place of justice, of rebellion, of tragedy, or of triumph. Wyatt Earp, more than any other figure, bridges that divide. He was a man of his time, flawed and fierce, and he was a myth for all time, shaped and reshaped until his name became larger than life. Nearly a century after his death, his shadow still lingers in American culture. In every story of the lone gunfighter, in every retelling of the frontier lawman who walks into danger without flinching, Wyatt Earp is there. And so, the man who walked down Fremont Street on that October afternoon in 1881 still walks with us today, not in flesh, but in legend, in memory, and in the timeless echo of the American West.